Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 6 of my organisational series. In this case I'll be investigating the divisions and brigades of the Polish Army in 1939. This video will be different from my other organisational videos, as the Polish Army was only in the field for a short time during World War II and there was very little changes in the divisions and brigades during the war. The greatest change actually occurred with the mechanised Cavalry Brigades. Before I continue, just a quick caveat about this video. The analysis of the TIEL has been focused on creating army lists for micro-army sets of rules. As a result, it would probably not meet the robust standards of a historical analysis. So if your expectations is an in-depth analysis of the structure of a division or brigade, this may not be what you need. In addition to that, a comment about my sources. In some cases I've obtained reasonably high quality official structural information. In other cases very unreliable TOE diagrams. The bulk of my information comes from the excellent Nyhorsa documents. In this case I use the source from the CARL site and the www.nyhorsa.org site. My other sources are too numerous to list, but they range from wargaming TOE books to the wiki pages. I generally do not include transport, supply, signals and other administrative formations in my videos. My main focus is the combat troops, although in an emergency I have to admit non-combat troops often found themselves in combat, so occasionally they will slip into the video. As for the actual overall Polish order of battle for the campaign, that's not something I'm going to be primarily focusing on, as my primary focus is the structure of the various divisional and brigade level formations within the Polish Army. There are nonetheless many other good sources which viewers can look at in order to obtain this information, even the wiki page. While I generally only resort to wiki if I have absolutely no choice, as I generally consider it as reasonably unreliable information, the wiki entry for the Polish Army Order of Battle in 1939 does contain some rather good maps, in this case the deployment of the Polish forces in terms of divisional and brigade level. We will now dive into the actual video itself and start with the Polish Infantry Division, which was the bedrock of the Polish Army and most other armies. The Polish Army was supposed to consist of 30 such divisions. The TNOE here shows the Polish Infantry Division at full strength. When the Germans invaded in 1939, many infantry divisions were not up to full strength and were still mobilising. The division followed a typical 3 infantry regiment, 1 artillery regiment structure. The supporting formations consisted of a reconnaissance battalion and an anti-tank battery. The Polish were reasonably well equipped with anti-tank weapons, and the 75mm guns were also very effective against tanks, although they could not ambush German tanks in the same manner as low-profile anti-tank guns. The Germans had not refined their doctrine, and tanks often went into action unsupported, allowing the Polish anti-tank guns to inflict some significant damage against German armour. The Rifle Regiment contained 9 37mm anti-tank guns, which I must admit is an impressive amount of anti-tank capability for a regiment. The regiment also contained 2 75mm guns, which could provide direct or indirect fire. I would guess they were mostly used in the direct fire role. The regiment also contained 2 81mm mortars, which I must admit is not an impressive number. I expect the 75mm guns would supplement this, but indirect fire capacity was a weakness of the Rifle Regiment. However, to compensate for this lack of medium mortars, each regiment contained a total of 27 45mm light mortars. While the shell of this light mortar was rather small, basically a large grenade, it certainly did have an impact. It was a very useful compensation considering the weakness in other indirect fire capability, and also very effective in defence, although not so effective in offence. I cannot be certain of the company size, but 140 men per company was the only source I could obtain. This made for a rather small company, especially for 1939. Drilling down into the company, the rifle company was rather basic, as can be seen here. One issue I really had that was rather difficult was to determine the strength of the rifle company. The only rather unreliable source I could find indicated it's 140 men, and this was based on the French TIEL. I have no idea if it's accurate. The heavy weapons company was equally basic, and once again I had significant issues in obtaining the manpower of this formation. I obtained a manpower, or possible manpower, of 140 men, but I suspect this was actually the infantry company rather than the heavy weapons company. I can count up to 43 men by looking at the formations, but I suspect this is a rather low number. So, in summary, I think it's probably somewhere between 140 and 43 men. Looking at the artillery regiment, and also there was some variation, each division contained 12 light howitzers, normally 100mm. I suspect in some cases it could have even been 105mm, or the older 105s, along with 24 75mm guns. The 75mm guns were a useful dual-purpose weapon in the early war period, and as the Polish rarely conducted offensive actions, the light shells were not a major issue. The weapons were all World War I vintage, but were nonetheless serviceable weapons. I suspect counter-battery fire was not possible with these weapons, so those more complex tasks would be carried out by corps-level artillery. Supporting the division was a cavalry reconnaissance battalion and an anti-tank battery armed with 37mm anti-tank guns. I'm uncertain how many divisions contained this anti-tank formation. Based on the total number of guns, I suspect all of them could have, in theory, had this additional anti-tank battery. The second most important component in the Polish army was its cavalry brigades. These were the elite formations of the Polish army, and while they did not intend to charge into contact, they were an effective mobile formation. The cavalry brigades came in two basic flavours, the 4-regiment and 3-regiment versions. The structure consisted, as I've indicated, 3 or 4 cavalry regiments, a motorised infantry battalion, and a cavalry artillery battalion. Supporting troops included a tankette company, as well as anti-tank and anti-aircraft and cycle company. The tankette company was often removed from this formation and placed under corps or army command. The cavalry regiment contained 37mm anti-tank guns as well as 45mm light mortars. It was effectively a mounted light infantry regiment, or actually really battalion, and would normally dismount to fight, although it was weak in indirect fire weapons. In a defensive position, it would be rather effective, and this was its main role in the 1939 invasion of Poland. Because it was all mounted, it was comparatively mobile, which is also a rather important factor in defending against the German onslaught. The Cavalry Brigade also contained a motorised infantry battalion, which contained 81mm mortars. I would expect this would represent the pointy end of the brigade and capable of some offensive operation with its minimal indirect fire capability. Supported by the tankettes, it could provide a useful mobile attack force. The Artillery Brigade consisted of 12 75mm guns, which for a brigade may have been reasonable, but it really limited its ability to launch an offensive operation. The Motorised Infantry Company was effectively a standard rifle company mounted in trucks, which was a standard way of deploying this kind of formation in 1939 for pretty much all the combatants. The Motorised Heavy Weapon Company was also basically a standard heavy weapons company mounted in trucks, but the battalion did possess more support formations which would have been distributed to the rifle companies, or the motorised rifle companies, in the same manner as the assets of the Heavy Weapons Company. The brigade had a reasonable number of support companies. The Light Armoured Company is very interesting, although to the best of my knowledge most were pulled from the cavalry brigades and concentrated at corps level. If present in the cavalry brigade and combined with the motorised infantry battalion, this could have provided a significant offensive powerful force. The inclusion of 40mm anti-aircraft guns is also rather interesting. I'm uncertain how many brigades were equipped with these guns, but I suspect they would have been rather useful when attacked by German aircraft, as this formation was reasonably mobile and used to plug gaps. It probably needed this anti-aircraft capability. While technically a cavalry brigade that had been mechanised, the Polish army had 2 mechanised brigades. The 10th Cavalry Brigade was the only fully operational Polish motorised infantry unit during the entire invasion war. The Warsaw Armoured Motorised Brigade was not completed by the 1st of September 1939, was formed during the war. The survivors of a tank battalion joined the 10th Cavalry Brigade during the war, as well as additional attached formations such as artillery. This lists the armoured formations of the Polish Army. While I consider this source as excellent, in my research the formations did change during the campaign, so you need to consider that. An example was the 7 TP battalions. One battalion joined one of the mechanised brigades, but only after suffering heavy losses. For players who wish to recreate the Polish armoured forces, I suspect looking at their start forces with an understanding changes would have occurred during the campaign is probably the only strategy that kind of works, or is the wisest strategy anyway. The chart that I showed comes from the excellent Blitzkrieg Armour and Camouflage and Markings 1939 and 1940 by Stephen J. Zaloga. I highly recommend anyone interested in this topic to get a copy of this excellent book. The 10th Cavalry Mechanised Brigade consisted of 2 motorised regiments, or really battalions, and a motorised artillery battalion. Under brigade headquarters there was a number of supporting companies, 3 tank companies, an anti-tank and a rather small anti-aircraft company. It proved to be well led and caused the Germans a great deal of trouble down south. A tank battalion joined it during the invasion, and with the tank battalion this represented a reasonable powerful mechanised formation. However, it was grossly outnumbered and unable to change the course of the war. The Motorised Cavalry Regiment, or actually a Motorised Rifle Battalion, was a reasonably powerful motorised battalion. I suspect its cavalry roots is why it's called a regiment, but in reality it's a battalion. As with most infantry, it had 37mm anti-tank guns, 81mm mortars, and quite a few 45mm light mortars. In terms of support battalions, there wasn't really very much. There was a anti-tank battalion, or at least that's what it's called. In reality, it's a very small mechanised anti-tank company. The artillery battalion, although it was fully motorised, consisted of only 4 75mm guns and 4 100mm howitzers, so it wasn't particularly powerful. However, for a brigade, it was probably reasonable. The most interesting part of the support companies is the light anti-tank companies and medium tank companies. This represents a pseudo-tank battalion, which, if combined with the 2 motorised battalions, would make this a powerful combined armed formation. I'm uncertain if they fought in that manner, I suspect not, but with the correct doctrine this would have been a very useful formation for counter-attacks. Large number of the anti-tank guns, the large number of anti-tank guns is unusual. Again, I'm kind of uncertain how real it is, but the Polish did actually have enough anti-tank guns to equip all their brigades in using these standard numbers, so it could very well be accurate. The 2nd Mechanised Brigade was being formed in Warsaw when the Germans invaded. As a result, it was incomplete and was quickly put into action. During the later stages of the war, the survivors of one of the tank regiments, or battalions, was added to it, as well as 2 independent artillery battalions. Other formations may have been added as well. This represents an estimate of what it may have looked like just before its destruction or surrender. The motorised battalion, to the best of my knowledge, was the same as the motorised battalion that you would find in the Cavalry Brigade, so I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. I'm mainly going to focus on the support elements. Now, this artillery here, and anti-aircraft artillery, was almost certainly attached to this formation in a very ad hoc manner, and as a result this had quite a bit of artillery. To the best of my knowledge, this artillery was actually corps level artillery that was attached to the formation. The light tank battalion is also quite interesting. According to this, there was actually a battalion headquarters level. In the other mechanised brigade, the independent companies were directly attached to the brigade, so I'm not quite sure if the battalion formation that you see here was ad hoc or if it was formal, but nonetheless these 2 companies were also found in the 10th Mechanised Brigade as well. The final brigade, which consists of a 7 TP company. Now, the 7 TP company almost certainly represented the survivors of the battalion that consisted of this particular type of medium tank, or light tank, I suppose. So this would have been an ad hoc attachment. And the 13 TK or TKS light tanks were basically the light tanks that you would also find in the mechanised brigade. Now, or the 10th Mechanised Brigade. I'm assuming that the Polish at some point in time decided to organise their armour into two separate tank battalions, which actually does make sense as there are two motorised infantry battalions. This would prove to be a very effective tank force. The only issue, of course, is doctrine. Were they actually trained to actually have infantry and armour working together? I mean, the French had a lot of tanks and a lot of motorised infantry, but they weren't trained in terms of combined action. And my gut feeling is the Polish were probably the same. On the other hand, the Polish, being a comparatively impoverished country, desperately outnumbered, when you're in that kind of position, you tend to be a lot more innovative than when you feel rather superior. So you never know. They may have actually got the combined arms working extremely well with this particular formation, at least for the very short time that it was in existence. The other attached formation is the anti-tank battalion. Once again, quite a bit of anti-tank guns. As indicated earlier, the Polish did actually have this many guns, so this could actually be quite valid. And considering that the Warsaw Mechanised Brigade was primarily used in defence around Warsaw, it makes sense that it would contain quite a bit of anti-tank weapons. A quick note about the Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun, which was the primary anti-tank weapon of the Polish army. As far as I can work out, the Polish army had about 1,200 of these weapons, which I must admit really surprised me when I sort of found this information. Now, if this was correct, then, as there were 30 infantry divisions, each which was supposed to have 27 anti-tank guns, that would absorb about 810 of the 1,200. The Cavalry Brigades require an additional 252 guns, leaving actually more than enough guns for the Mechanised Brigades or even other formations such as the Mountain Brigades. Based on this, it looks like the Polish army had more than enough guns to equip all their divisions of brigade with a full complement of anti-tank guns that is shown in the TONE so far. While not specifically part of the divisions or brigades, I just wanted to cover the corps level artillery. In terms of artillery, this shows the only data I could find. The 100mm howitzers were all allocated to the infantry divisions, but the 105 and the 120 were allocated at corps level. It's quite possible some of the older 105 WZ13s were also part of the infantry divisions. There was some heavier artillery, a couple of, some 155mm, etc., but I lacked details on their numbers, so I'm not going to include here. The 105 WZ29 was a very modern weapon and would have all been towed using half-track or other effective tow vehicle, which the Polish seem to be quite, well equipped with. As I've indicated earlier, this video is mainly based on research which was designed to create army lists for micro-armour rules, which used a platoon to company as its basic element. As a result, it's not focused on the very low level structure of any formation, which would be the case if this was designed for a skirmish or squad scale set of rules. In my analysis, which incidentally you can download from my Kriegspiel.io group site, I've attempted to provide accurate information down to the company level, so players could feel individual company elements or bases in a micro-armour set of rules. As companies would often have other formations attached to them, particularly from support companies, this may not be the most accurate way of depicting the companies. At the battalion or regimental level, the values are as historically accurate as I could get. So, as a result, an option is to make the battalion the accurate unit within any kind of micro-armour rules, and then simply divide the strength of the battalion into the smaller parts based on the scale of the rules that you need. Now, they may not accurately represent a company or platoon, but when all together, they do represent the battalion. A lot of this really depends on the rules being used, but that's the basic thought processes behind the structures that I've showed you so far in the TONE charts. It's incidentally based on an old book which provided TONEs for a very old set of rules going way back before the 1970s. If you're using a set of rules where each element represents a battalion, then this shows an example from the Neue Schwerpunkt rules, which is a figure-based version of the SPI Modern Battles board game. Each element here represents a battalion. And so we come to an end of the video. This concludes part 6 of my video series, or my organisational video, in this case covering the Polish army in World War II. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.